Are you sick?
Wheel and the Butterfly, written by Justice 3442, and
Read by Justice.
there's a plane. Chapter 32, Pinky vs. Bellagio. Ooh, ah! Pinky called out from her seat as she admired the giant streams of water that shot up into the sky. This was quickly followed by the click of her camera. Dan rubbed his self-inflicted bruised head.
Well, at least the singing stopped once we got into Vegas. But does she have to do that at every friggin' thing she sees? Pinky.
Dan called out.
Mustache Mr. Mumbles.
Uh-huh, Pinky said affirmatively, reaching into the brown box and pulling out a small fake mustache. Dan picked the cat up from the middle seat and held her up towards Pinky. Mr. Mumbles protested.
I know it itches, Mr. Mumbles.
Dan replied, his voice a bit gentler than his normal tone.
But it's the only way we can get you in.
Mr. Mumbles reluctantly allowed Pinky to apply the small mustache below her nose. Elise turned and looked at the trio in the backseat skeptically.
A fake mustache? That's enough?
She asked. Dan shrugged.
Don't ask me why it works.
Mustache applied, Mr. Mumbles crawled up Dan's arm and onto his shoulder. Ooh, ah, Pinky said as she looked up at the large, somewhat rectangular hotel that shot up over a dozen stories into the sky. A large pillar-like structure sat in the middle with a dome that resembles a crown that read Bellagio. To the left and right of the pillar, dozens of hotel rooms shot off in a very slightly curved line, giving the entire building a gentle, rounded look. Click. Chris pulled the car up to the front and a valet in a red shirt and black pants approached to take his keys. Chris handed him the keys and walked towards the entrance of the hotel with Elise. The man held out a hand, palm up to Dan as Dan walked by. Dan slapped it with a
Sup?
and small smile.
What is it with these guys in low-fives?
The man frowned and raised his hand up towards Mr. Mumbles, who meowed and gave it a swat with his paw. Dan continued after Elise and Chris. Pinky approached the man, her hand already held up in the air high at face level. High five, she said enthusiastically. With some degree of confusion, the man slapped her hand. Pinky giggled and bounded after Dan as the 4 people and 1 cat, or 5 people as near as anyone could tell, entered the hotel. Ooh, ah, Pinky said as she looked at an explosion of rainbow-colored art above her. Bright, colorful glass and somewhat spherical shapes jutted towards the ground off stems as if a meadow of glass flowers was growing on the ceiling. Click. The group continued through the beige and red lobby and into a large hall of an assortment of gambling tables, games, and slot machines, as noises poured in from all directions and people walked about from game to game, or sat fixed in front of a machine. Waitresses walked about with an assortment of beverages held high on trays. Ooh, ah, click. Dan scoffed at his surroundings.
This place is too pretentious.
Dan, it's a Bellagio, Chris said in a slightly vexed tone of voice.
I don't care if they gave it a fancy name, it's going on the list.
Dan declared, pulling out a notepad, flipping towards the end and writing the Bellagio down with a pencil. Pinky frowned. I think it's pretty and kinda neat. If I were trying to turn away from crowds and noises and stuff, I'd probably like to see more of it.
You'll get to see more of it when we come back to burn it down,
Dan countered. Pinky's frown widened, her lower lip puffing out a bit. But I don't want to burn it down. Isn't that a little extreme? She asked. Elise leaned over to Dan and softly reminded,
We're taking Chris and Pinky to an all-you-can-eat buffet here.
Dan paused.
You know what, Pinky? You're right.
Dan said with an evil smile.
I'm sure we can figure out a more appropriate punishment later.
Hooray! Pinky said happily, wrapping her arms around one of Dan's and pounding a quick peck on his cheek. You're the bestest, Dan.
Yeah, I know.
Dan replied with a smile. Elise rolled her eyes with a smile.
I see being the bestest only requires not burning down entire structures.
Soon the group arrived in front of a large door with the word buffet printed above it in large blue letters in front of brick-like golden and dark brown lit panels. "5?" a young woman in a white button-up shirt asked from behind a podium.
Meow.
Mr. Mumbles responded. The woman smiled. Right this way, please. She led the 5 past a long line of people leading down the hall. Did Mr. Mumbles just get us past the line? Chris asked, surprised. Dan shot Elise a smug look.
And you weren't sure about bringing her on the trip.
The young woman led them into a spacious dining room of beige tiled floors and wooden tables with padded wooden chairs sitting under them. Tall, old-fashioned street lamps extended from the floor on poles, providing light along with smaller lights embedded in the brown, red, and blue tiled ceiling. Pinky gasped, and Chris made an excited, hungry sound as the 2 looked over marble and glass counters upon counters filled with seafood, meats, sushi, fruits, veggies, and pastries. Pinky turned to Dan, his arm still held firmly in hers. "And I could eat as much of this as I want?" she said in disbelief. Dan's evil grew like a bent and twisted tree, shooting gnarled branches off in all directions.
"Yep, have as much as you want."
Pinky's eyes went wide and her smile spread across her face like water slowly poured onto a sheet of glass. Soon. A young, clean-shaven man in a white chef's coat, white pants, and a chef apron huddled behind the dessert counter.
"I'm not sure how much more I can take,"
he announced as his body shook. "Hang in there, Freddy." An older man with shoulder-length white hair and a close-cropped beard, also in a chef's uniform, responded, sitting next to a young man on the ground. "We trained for this."
"But we only ever prepared for one S-level eater, not two."
Freddy protested in a panicked tone. "Oh, he's right, Hubert." A young, brown-haired woman responded, her hair tied into a tight bun against the back of her head, also huddled on the ground. "The kitchen staff has buckled under the pressure." She gulped. "They've gone feral. Last I saw, they had erected a pig's head on a pole and were dancing around it and chanting." "They'll finish eating soon, Mary, don't worry," Hubert said, assuring himself as much as anyone.
"But they've only been here 20 minutes!"
Freddy reminded. "Ooh, one last piece of carrot cake!" Pinky exclaimed, walking up to the counter. She added it to a plate filled with baked goods and continued back to her table. Freddy gasped.
"The last piece of carrot cake? How dare she take the cake?"
Hubert's expression went grim. "I'm sorry, Freddy. You'll have to alert the kitchen staff." The color drained from Freddy's face.
"But..."
Hubert pulled out a large wooden spoon from his coat and handed it to him. "Here, use this to protect yourself."
"Is it a magic spoon?"
Freddy asked, hopefully. Hubert shrugged. Yeah, sure. You go with the protection of the mighty spoon," he answered, handing the spoon to Freddy. Freddy took it and rose to his feet resolutely.
"I shall not fail you! Boom!"
he shouted as he ran towards the kitchen. "Pray for him, Mary," Hubert said quietly. Soon the sounds of Freddy talking to the kitchen staff could be heard.
"Hey guys, we're out of carrot cake and..."
He was cut off as the sound of wild growling and tearing of clothing was heard.
Why, Spoon, why?"
Freddy called as the noises intensified into a crescendo of savage violence. Mary closed her eyes and murmured something to herself, making the sign of the cross across her chest with her right hand. Hey guys. Mary and Hubert flinched, looking up to see a smiling face of a tall man with short brown hair. Yes, sir? Hubert asked. You're out of ice cream, Chris began. Could you... Right away, sir. Hubert turned to the woman sitting next to him and put his hands on her shoulders. Go into the kitchen, Mary, and sneak towards the freezer. Retrieve the ice cream mix and bring it back. Stay in the shadows. Hubert's voice dropped in a whisper. Stay safe. Mary put a hand on one of Hubert's. Oh, I won't fail you. Mary slinked off towards the kitchen. Hubert stood up to look at Chris. One of my best, he said, motioning to Mary with a nod of his head. Chris smiled as he filled his plate with confectionaries. Great service here, by the way. Hubert smiled weakly. Thank you, sir. Elise regarded the huge stacks of plates sitting next to Chris and Pinky and leaned over to Dan.
Satisfied? These two got the staff here to go all Lord of the Flies in roughly 15 minutes.
She mentioned over a plate of crab legs. Dan sat in front of a plate loaded high with meat and a small portion of steamed veggies to the side. Dan rubbed his chin, considering this.
Well, that's pretty good. Though I kinda would like to hurt the casino directly.
He grinned.
Maybe we should give Pinky a few energy drinks,
he suggested. Elise raised an eyebrow at him.
Do you want to spend several hours trapped in a car with the hyperactive, caffeinated Pinkie Pie? Touch!
Ooh, Pinky said, squirming in her chair slightly as she wiped cake frosting off her lips with a napkin. My back is itchy.
So?
Dan asked. Pinky smiled. That means it's my lucky day.
Is this a Pinky Sense thing?
Dan asked with a creased brow. Uh-huh, Pinky responded, enthusiastically bobbing her head up and down. Pinky Sense? Chris asked through a mouthful of cake. Woo, my body gives me these little niggling feelings that something's going to happen, Pinky explained.
Pinky has pulled me out of the way of about a dozen flower pots that mysteriously fell from the sky at some time or another,
Dan added, motioning to Pinky with a hand.
Really?
Elise asked, skeptically.
How does it work?
Pinky raised her hands into a shrug, smile still on her face as she shook her head slightly. I have no idea.
All I know is that it does, and that's good enough for me,
Dan said.
Well, I'd like to study it sometime,
Elise offered. Pinky's smile turned pensive. It's probably not as fun sounding as you think it would be, she answered.
Hey!
Dan interjected.
Maybe when you two are done eating, you could try a few games at the casino.
Dan said to Pinky as a mischievous grin entered his features. Pinky considered this, resting her cheek against her hand and a forefinger. Well, we really should be on our way soon.
Come on!
Dan insisted.
Just a few games. It'll be fun.
Pinky smiled back at him. I do like things that are fun. Pinky turned to Chris. Wanna go for one more helping? Chris smiled. Do I? Hubert and a bruised and scratched Mary groaned and ducked behind the dessert counter once more as the two approached. A sharply dressed woman waved to the group as a blue sedan was pulled up. Come back soon, you're always welcome, Mr. Bellagio. Pinky smiled and waved back with her free hand, a heavy-duty silver case in her other. Thank you, I had a great time, bye-bye! I can't believe they wanted to give us a suite, Chris said with a big smile.
Of course.
Dan commented, happily crossing the Bellagio off his list.
They probably hoped they could get their money back.
Elise was too busy laughing hysterically to respond. How much do you think she won? Chris asked.
I lost count after the first 100,000.
Dan answered with an evil grin. The same red-shirted valet from before exited the car and handed the keys to Chris. Before Chris could grab them, Elise quickly snatched them and announced,
I'll drive.
Chris smiled and walked over to the passenger seat. Elise giggly entered the driver's side. The valet sighed and held a palm out to Dan, who gave it a slap and the valet a smile. The valet raised his hands to Mr. Mumbles, who swatted at it again. He held up his hand for Pinky, who shoved a bundle of money in it. Buy yourself something extra nice, Pinky said with a smile as she walked over to the car. The valet's jaw dropped as he examined the large sum of money he was just handed. Chris looked through the rearview mirror as the valet began giddily dancing about. How much did you just give him? Chris asked, looking back towards Pinky. Pinky shrugged cheerfully. Oh, I don't know. Whatever's in one of those stacks they filled the case with. Chris just smiled as Elise broke into another fit of laughter. Dan simply chuckled slightly as he removed his mustache from Mr. Mumbles and began stroking her. So, Pinky, Chris began, looking back to look at the backseat with a smile. What should we sing next? The levity from Dan and Elise's faces fell to the earth and burned up on re-entry. Ooh, I know! Pinky immediately broke into song. This is the song that never ends. Chris smiled and joined in. Yes, it goes on and on, my friends. Elise looked back at Dan, who held up his green bottle of chloroform. Elise nodded. Some people started singing it, not knowing what it was, and they'll continue singing it forever just because. 5 minutes outside Las Vegas. This is a song that never ends, Chris said, deep in sleep. Dan grunted as he held up Chris's legs under the knees.
I think he ate his own weight in prime ribs.
Elise likewise struggled as she held up Chris with her hands placed under his arms.
I just wish they'd stop singing.
Yes, it was. Pinky replied from the back seat, Mr. Mumbles sleeping on her lap in a fuzzy gray ball. With no small amount of effort, Dan and Elise loaded the unconscious Chris into the back seat. Elise leaned over to fasten his seatbelt. So, Elise returned to the driver's seat as Dan sat down in the passenger seat.
At least they're quieter now.
Dan said irritably. The two continued their infinite duet, complete with synchronized snores from the back.
I can't believe they're keeping in time with each other, though. They both must be on the same doofus wavelength.
Dan commented, irritation still present in his voice. With a sigh, he turned to Elise.
So how long do you think Chris will be out?
Dan asked. Elise sighed, started the car, and started to pull back onto the freeway.
Maybe we can get to Salt Lake before he's up. I think he's starting to build up resistance to chloroform.
Elise glanced over at Dan.
What about Pinky? We'll be very lucky if we get that far. Pinky has some sort of crazy fast metabolism.
Dan answered.
I think it's because she never stops moving, ever.
Elise scrunched her mouth to a side of her face.
I'll drive fast.
After a bit of relative silence, the singing and gentle snoring becoming little more than quiet background noise, Elise spoke up.
So, how are things with you and Pinky?
Dan took a break from staring out at the expansive desert to look back at Elise.
You mean besides her recent attempt to club me to death?
Elise smiled nervously.
Yes, aside from that.
Dan shrugged.
I guess she's been less hopeless now that she isn't tripping over stuff every 5 minutes. That's it?
Elise asked, a small amount of disappointment entering her voice. Dan eyed Elise wearily.
What the bleep am I supposed to say?
He faced forward and motioned with his hands out the road in front of the car.
We have fun together at the apartment, we go out for food or vengeance purposes, and sometimes people get hurt, or something gets burned down, and we have fun then too. Come on!
Elise said with a smile.
You spend almost every waking second with a girl, and probably every sleeping second with her, and you really don't see her as more than your roommate? Well...
Dan trailed off, staring off into the road as white stripes and white poles adorned with orange reflectors on the top zoomed towards and past the car.
I guess she's a bit more than that,
he admitted. Elise smiled to herself as she slowly broke down Dan's defenses.
Just take a look back there at that cute sleeping girl in the backseat and tell me how you feel.
Dan narrowed eyes laced with suspicion at Elise, but complied nonetheless. He twisted in his chair and looked behind him. Pinky looked uncharacteristically peaceful in her pink dress as her head rested against her blue jacket-clad shoulder. Light poured into the back of the car and her bright curly pink hair shimmered in the rays. Her light skin was turned golden as a Nevada sun washed over her sleeping face and down her décolletage to the neckline of her dress. Dan's eyes widened as his pupils dilated as he sat transfixed by the sleeping beauty in front of him.
I feel...
He began to answer.
Yes?
Elise cooed.
Yes, it goes on.
Pinky murmured.
I feel a strong and sudden urge to crawl back there and stick a rag in her mouth.
Dan said, his eyes narrowing into slits. He reached for his seatbelt buckle. Elise quickly reached over and put a hand on Dan's arm.
Unhand me, strumpet!
Language. Dan protested, turning his head to leverage an angry glare at Elise.
Do you want to wake her up?
Elise asked, lowering her chin and staring at Dan with large, inquisitive eyes. Dan sighed and settled back into his seat. After another pause, Dan spoke up.
Favorite horror movie?
Elise asked. Dan raised an eyebrow.
Did I stutter? Favorite horror movie?
He stressed. Elise paused and answered.
The Campground Chainsaw Unpleasantness.
Her mouth pulled up into a smile.
Yeah, I hear that.
Dan said, smiling back and holding up a fist. Elise gave him a friendly fist bump. Elise turned back to the road.
Okay, my turn. Favorite zombie movie?
Dan smiled.
Night of the Living Dead.
He paused and added,
1968. Ooh, old school, eh?
Dan shrugged.
Gotta love the classics. Yours? World War Z. Ha!
Dan interrupted snidely.
Don't tell me it's just because of Brad Pitt. Well, he is handsome.
Elise said, trailing off slightly.
Yeah, he sure is.
Dan said wistfully. He shook his head to clear it.
I mean, you have to have a better reason than that.
Elise shrugged and blushed slightly.
I kinda like the agent running around the world fighting zombies aspect.
She admitted.
Ah, so it's a spy thing. Hey, you gotta admit the whole attack on Israel was pretty cool.
Dan chuckled.
Alright, I'll give you that. Vampire movie? Wait, let me guess. Interview with the Vampire.
Dan said with a smug smile.
Don't think you could get me on the Pitt angle.
Elise responded, mirroring Dan's smile.
Let the right one in.
Dan frowned slightly.
The Swedish one? I only saw the American.
He admitted. Elise smiled.
I'll have to let you borrow it. It's great. Your turn. From Dusk Till Dawn.
Dan replied. Elise scoffed slightly.
Still worshipping at Tarantino's altar, I see. I was sure you'd say Nosferatu. Hey, Tarantino is awesome!
Dan protested.
And Nosferatu is just for people who are desperate to show their culture.
Elise giggled.
Tell me what you really think, Dan. Let's see. Werewolf?
The blue sedan cruised over the highway, occupied by the sounds of two sleeping occupants engaged in an endless song, punctuated by snores and another two happily comparing movie tastes.
Author's note, thanks to user Ryoga1100 for the song that never ends idea. Thanks for listening, listeners. Ow.
Okay, that is more than close enough to the microphone.